Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. As the whole world transfixed on Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, our businesses back home could be a target from Russian criminal gangs. And so, more than ever, you need to be vigilant with your security. From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. The current crisis in the Ukraine may be on the other side of the planet, but the shockwaves are being felt over here. Not only are we seeing increased petrol prices, but we could also see an uptick in cyber attacks on Australian businesses. That's according to Zaun Bhana, Managing Director of IT specialists Leap Consulting. He says the sanctions we've imposed not only on the Russian government, but Russian business entities and oligarchs may result in retaliatory attacks by cybercriminal gangs encouraged by Russian authorities. He explains shortly what you can do to best protect yourself from those cyber attacks. First, a bit more background. Zaun tells Chris Ashmore what else the Australian government has done to poke the Russian bear.
Australia has entered into a bilateral cyber policy dialogue with the Ukrainian government. And within that, they're providing cybersecurity training and cybersecurity upskilling to the Ukrainian government and, by virtue of their government, also the Ukrainian military. So with those sanctions that we've imposed on Russia, we're actually providing cybersecurity support. So we're giving them aid, in the form of money and resources, but we're also giving them technical support in the world of cybersecurity. So effectively that's saying Australian spies are training Ukrainian spies on how to defend against cyber attacks and perhaps even how to carry out those cyber attacks themselves.
And potentially the Russians aren't happy with us.
Correct. So because of that, that's going to make Australian organisations vulnerable. So, as part of that support that we're providing the Ukrainian forces, you could only draw the conclusion that would make us complicit in helping the Ukrainian forces, and therefore whatever the Russian government decides to do in the cybersecurity space could involve looking at allies like the US, UK, Europe, Australia, who are providing support and saying, hey, what can we do under the cover of the cyber espionage activities to get back at these organisations, distract them. So in some cases, replying or responding isn't an overt physical war. It's something that you do online under the cover of zeros and ones and bits and bytes to distract these governments and these other organisations from helping the Ukrainians.
And what does that mean for Australian organisations? What should we expect that they might do to us?
Well, I think if we look at what they've done just to the Ukraine, either prior to the escalation of the war or currently, they started off with attacks on government websites, so making those websites unavailable so the public couldn't reach them, they couldn't get necessary and critical information. They also took aim at the banking system, so disrupting banking, the ability to transact, to get onto your banking system. And you can imagine, even for everyday Australians, if our banking system is offline or unavailable, that's a considerable threat and considerable risk and a considerable concern for everyone. So where that quickly escalated to is the Russian cybersecurity agencies began to attack Ukrainian infrastructure like telecommunications, mobile towers, mobile communications, messaging. And if you were to look at that and think, well, if they did that against other countries, either deliberately or from a spillover point of view, they're denying service, denying access, they could put us in a very difficult position in terms of our own ability to respond. And in the most severe examples, one of the threats that we've seen already in the last couple of weeks is that some of the attacks have just been about erasing and wiping any of those organisations' data or systems. And that completely takes them offline. So imagine pushing the big reset button on a company. That's what you can be faced with in an attack that we're seeing happen at the moment in the Ukraine.
So how vulnerable are businesses in Australia?
Australian companies are incredibly vulnerable. The best observation I would take away from this is a quote. It was from the CEO of ANZ at the time, Shane Elliott, back in September last year. In September last year, he said the majority of Australian businesses are hopelessly unprepared for cyber attacks. So the way you would think about that, if the leader of one of our big four banks, who probably has a wide scope of all of Australian companies and business preparedness, is saying that we're behind the eight ball, that is a massive concern for Australian companies, small business, big business, everyday consumers. Last month, the recruitment firm Robert Half came out and shared a statistic that 63% of companies in Australia are relying on overseas IT security and cybersecurity skills, which means we can't effectively even protect ourselves with the skills we have in Australia. So we're not prepared from a business perspective, and we're not prepared from a skilled perspective, and now we're supporting cyber security initiatives in a foreign war. You have to question how we would be able to respond.
Are there particular industries that are more vulnerable?
Absolutely. So if you think about it, critical industries for most Australians are finance, banking, access to money, access to funds, utilities, power, water, gas, all of those kind of essential utilities, transport and shipping, trucking, freight, logistics, ports, health, hospitals, medical centres, research facilities, military, obviously both public and private. There's a lot of infrastructure in Australia around private military support and manufacturing. And lastly, of course, government, all of the essential government services that we need. So all of those critical infrastructure organisations would be prime targets.
But other businesses too.
Well, if you think about it, in a small business world, you might think to yourself, well, I'm not a shipping company, I'm not a bank, how would I be impacted? Well, you've got to remember, most of us as organisations, probably somewhere in the supply chain, are dealing with some of the suppliers to these big companies or as third-party suppliers. Now, simple example, in the case of Target, I think back in 2016, there was a Target hack that ended up costing them something like $160 million. That happened through the air conditioning contractor company. Now, that company was a small 20-person business. And so when you think about that, that's how these small businesses become stepping stones. So yes, they're not a target. Yes, no one cares about them, but they're a stepping stone into these bigger companies and bigger infrastructure businesses. So small businesses are absolutely potentially exposed, but also cyber warfare is based on software. Software doesn't typically know the boundary of a country from one country to the next. It just knows internet addresses. And if there's a vulnerability, it'll jump from one to the next to the next.
What's the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, and what has it recommended that organisations do?
Well, the ACSC, it is known, Australian Cybersecurity Centre, is kind of our peak advisory body in Australia for government and business on cybersecurity. So it's your go-to resource, and they provide security advisory, security reports, alerting, best practices, resources, and even directives on how to deal with cybersecurity. They effectively should be every business and consumer's first stop when it comes to cybersecurity and their journey. And, recently they put out an alert to all Australian organisations, both public and private, large and small, to say that we should be prepared for an incident. And their way of wording that was we should urgently adopt an enhanced cybersecurity posture. And basically, Chris, that just means we need to be ready for the punch. And if as a small business, you're thinking, right, we need to be ready for an attack. If someone came up to you and said, hey, tomorrow night, your business is going to be robbed. The question you would ask yourself is, well, what do I need to do to prepare for that? How can I stop that happening? And that's what the ACSC is saying to Australian organisations, be prepared for an attack.
And so what should businesses do? What do you recommend?
Yeah, we have to remember, like at the big end of town, in those critical infrastructure, they've got teams and teams of people to deal with this kind of thing. For most of us, it's the owner, it's the finance person. And maybe they outsource it, maybe they have an IT partner, or maybe they have an internal IT person who does it day to day. I think like anything, if you have to look at how do you protect yourself, the first step in knowing that is, well, what are our gaps? If you were to take it back to your house and say, well, tomorrow night, or your business premises is going to be robbed. Are all my windows locked? Do I lock the door? Who else has a key? These are the same questions you should be asking about your cybersecurity. Are all my windows locked? Who has keys? Are all the people that come into the business after hours, do they know them? Do the cleaners have keys? Do I know who works for the cleaners? All of these simple questions are things you should start asking about your cybersecurity. Now, the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has all of these questions laid out for organisations. It's totally free and online. And they have what's called the Essential 8. These are the Essential 8 steps that you can take to kind of mitigate 80% of the risks that you would see for cybersecurity. So we advise all organisations, and big or small, the first place to start is, okay, where are we exposed? And even if you don't know that step, is you go to this cybersecurity website, look at the Essential 8, either give it to your internal IT person, give it to your IT partner, or start to even ask, in the case of cyber insurance, so there's a lot of organisations now who insure against cyber incidents. It's kind of the same thing as knowing, well, if we did get robbed, we have insurance against theft. Well, cybersecurity is no different. Do you have insurance for cybersecurity? A lot of insurance companies have guides for small businesses on how to prepare and be ready for that.
That was Zaun Bhana, Managing Director of Leap Consulting. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow @BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.